Ladies and gentlemen, the ultimate event of the evening, may I please introduce Chris Packham, who's going to give you the keynote address. Chris Packham.
Hello, sorry about that. I was so engrossed in conversation. Moaning, of course. Good afternoon. When I was at school, unfortunately, I had to give up art. I was really fond of art. I like making things. I'm sculpting things at the moment. Brutalist sculptures of goshawks. They won't be appearing on your internet platforms. But I like making things, so I had to give up art to study sciences. So I entered myself into O-level art. I felt confident that I might be able to pass it. And part of that examination was to draw with pencil, still life. So I bought 3 brown trout in, and I laid them in Dutch style on the poshest plate that we had. Well, in fact, I had to borrow it from my grandmother because we didn't have any posh plates, but she had some. And I sketched away for 2 hours, and as I was handing it the drawing in, I looked at the highlight in the eye of one of the trout, and I realised that I'd got it wrong. And it caused me no end of grief. A few years later, I was taking my driving test, and I had to do the reverse parking. And I just touched the curb. And I saw the guy who was sat next to me, and he had a clipboard in those days and a pencil, and you had to perform a number of tasks. Some of you, of course, here are old enough to remember the ordeal as it was at that time. And he sort of tapped the clipboard, and I thought, oh, God, I could have done that better. And at the time, these were things that I used to sort of beat myself up about. I did pass it, by the way, the O-level. And I did pass my driving test as well, actually. But nevertheless, I carried a tiny amount of regret about failing in that regard. Never did I think that I would get to the age of 62 and consider that a large part of my life has been ineffective. The most crucial and critical part of my life has probably been ineffective, or less effective than it needed to be. Because I got into wildlife before I was crawling around. You know, it was ladybirds, it was tadpoles in an old baby's bath. I grew up in a 3 up, 3 down with a tiny garden about half the size of this room, but there was enough there to ignite a passion which has burned for a lifetime, fueled my fascination and curiosity, and it still gets me out of bed, probably earlier than most people, because I just want to be out there, feeling it, seeing it, smelling it, touching it, getting stung by it. And I grew up loving it, and then I wanted to understand it. So I thought I'd pursue an academic career, maybe even stick in the academic world, actually. But by the time I got to my undergraduate degree, I'd obviously grown into a world where the disappearance of that wildlife was becoming palpable. Not only because it was being so critically and accurately measured by the enormous wealth of talent that we have in the UK. There's no doubt at all that when it comes to our wildlife populations, we have our finger more firmly on the pulse than anywhere else in the world. We know what's happening to changes in distribution and population, so on and so forth. So we can speak very critically about that, and we will be doing so actually on the 28th of this month when the next State of Nature report is published. And that report will be published without any ambiguity of its contents. So that's good. But not so good if you're the young kid that got his binoculars in 1970, and by the 1980s, most of the things that you saw as common birds when you first peered through those cheap broken Boots binoculars had already disappeared, because the warning bells were already ringing. And by the time I'd graduated, I realised that probably my job wasn't going to be sitting in an ivory tower thinking about how many times a second the syrinx of a yellowhammer fluctuates, produce its little bit of bread and no cheese song, but actually about the diminishing number of yellowhammers, none of which now nest anywhere near my home. And yet when I first had those binoculars, I would use them to find their nest and look at their beautifully inscribed little eggs. So we have grown into a world which has been falling apart around us. And, of course, that progress has been exacerbated and has got worse and worse. And now it's become part and parcel of everyone's daily life, not just us who have a focused fascination on the natural world. And yet, since 1988, when Hanlon first went to the Senate and talked about, as it was then, global warming, we've known that we've needed to act. And yet here we are in 2023, and the world's on fire, the world's being flooded, people are dying, their lives and livelihoods are being wrecked. And at the moment, largely, we're watching that on our television screens. But as a naturalist, of course, I step outside my door and the willow warblers are gone and the commas aren't as common as they used to be. Didn't see a single small tortoiseshell butterfly all summer, despite the fact that the abundance of other species has actually increased. So for us who are into nature, those changes are all very apparent the minute that we wake up in the morning. But for the vast majority of people, in the UK, at this point in time, it's a little bit cosy. It's over there, it's happening to them and not us. Well, that's going to change pretty rapidly, I imagine. All temperature records are being broken. I don't need to come here today and give you the stats. You'll either be aware of them, you may not have learned them off pat, but you'll be aware of them, and you'll certainly be watching them in the media, whether it's social or mainstream. We're in deep, deep trouble. And we have to act to overcome that trouble as rapidly as possible. We have to make up for lost time. How are we going to do that? Well, firstly, we're going to need some fuel, some energy. My energy is in large part, fueled by the guilt that I have spoken about. I've been part of that generation that has known more rapidly since 1988. We've been tinkering around the edges, not addressing the biggest issues and dealing with the problem. And now we find ourselves at the precipice of catastrophe, not surprisingly. And when it comes to wildlife, I've just been speaking to the CEO of the Wildlife Trust. We can do it. The Trust can do it. We can reinstate, we can repair, we can restore, we can reintroduce. We've tried and tested and built techniques. Sometimes we've failed, but we perfected them. And they work. Where we focus our conservation endeavours, where we've got good funding, we've got good energy, good skill set, then locally we've achieved remarkable successes. But the State of Nature report, without any spoilers, is going to tell us that it's got worse since the last one. That we live in one of the most nature-depleted set of countries in the world, and effectively, to paraphrase it, I wish they'd saved some of the print, it's all going to hell in a handcart. I can't let that happen. I've got to do something. I'm 62, I'm running out of time and air and oxygen. I've got to actually stand up and make a difference. That's what we're all feeling. Now, whether you've got the same compunction to act because it's fueled by guilt is irrelevant. The fact that you've given up your time and energy to come here today is because you've manifested a commitment. You have a grave understanding of our predicament and you want to do something about it. That's the first step. I suppose that might be a parallel to some of the steps that we were taking, 15, 20, 25 years ago in the conservation movement, where we had lots of people who cared. I care about wildlife. But the problem was what we didn't do was transform that care into action rapidly enough. And even now we're struggling to get some of our leading NGOs to take the actions that they might or ought to be taking. And we don't really have the time for that anymore, which is why we need to act independently. And that's what I'm fortunate to be able to do. I can act independently. I have affiliations with the Wildlife Trust. I like the Wildlife Trust. I work closely with I live in Hampshire, so it's the Hampshire Wildlife Trust. I invest in them. I applaud what they do. But they alone cannot do enough. They need everyone to come on board. And that's what today's about, isn't it? It's about, ultimately, empowerment. Because, as we've seen this week, we can't trust those who we've elected, our elected representatives, people who, I imagine, if you think about it fundamentally in terms of how our democracy is meant to work, we go to the polls, put a cross in a box. We empower someone, therefore, to represent us, our views, our wishes, essentially our demands. And that's not been happening at all. Our demands seem to be unheard, they're uncared for. And it's a bit of a shame because I don't want to focus on the UK government's poor record or poor behaviour because quite clearly it's happening all over the world. It's not just here, is it? It's when it comes to environmental degradation, it's not just the UK, it's happening everywhere. So we can do what we typically do as being British, and that's go down the pub and have a good moan about it, you know, crying into our pint, or whatever. Or we can actually do something about it. And I think we've got to the point now where we've recognised, and you must have recognised, that we haven't got time to wait any longer. And what we've got on the table in terms of those people who we have elected to represent us are not doing essentially what we want, or not all of what we want as rapidly and broadly as we might want it. So from that point of view, it's about us. And we can't do it on our own. I don't have a skill set. I don't even have a complete skill set to affect conservation. You know, there might be one or two species that I might know just about enough about to be able to, you know, draw up an action plan that might be just about enough to get that, you know, going in the right direction. And I'm someone who's really a committed naturalist. But within our field, you know, there's a good degree of niche separation. Lots of people with specialist tasks that integrate together to produce a functional ecology of conservation. And I think in the past, those people's jobs were probably undervalued. You know, it wasn't a sector that attracted a lot of maybe economic interest and investment, but it pretty well soon will be. Because we've got to fix this, otherwise we've had it. That's it and all about it. And I'm not going to wait for someone else to fix it. I'm going to try and do it myself. My role is, I suppose, a conduit between the science and people who need to understand that science to be motivated to act. That's, I suppose, what I am. I'm a science communicator. I form that bridge. I take some things which are maybe a little bit complicated, make them comprehensible, and try and get other people to believe them so that they understand why they have to do something, why they have to make a change. And making changes is difficult. As I was saying earlier, you know, when we consider our species, we are remarkably intelligent, creative, imaginative, adaptable, but we're not very good at changing our minds. You know, I mean, look at the way I'm dressed. I've been wearing these for about the last, well, not this particular shirt, but I mean, I've had it for about 10 years, to be quite honest with you. Don't like to fast fashion things too much, but I'm glad you can't see my shoes, because I've been wearing those since I was about 15, you know. So we are slow to change our minds. It's not very comfortable, is it, to have to do something radically different. We'll put that off the last possible minute. Well, we don't have any minutes left. So trying to convince people that they've got to change their minds is quite a tough ask. Quite a lot of those people, if you push them, they become quite retaliatory and recalcitrant. Back them into a corner, they tend to lash out. And that's become part and parcel of my everyday life. Try and get people to change their minds quickly, sometimes they don't want to do that. But I think one of the mistakes we make when it comes to trying to get people to change their minds is that we present them with problems, not so much opportunities or solutions. But not here. That's part and parcel of what this whole expo is about. It's about opening people's eyes to the fact that change is an opportunity. It's a potentially lucrative opportunity, not just financially, but in terms of quality of life or even life expectancy itself. So in a way, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's got to happen. It could happen comfortably. It could be a just transition, or it could be a last-minute grab. And when it comes to significant changes, I think there are two examples which we could draw upon to cite that when the human species is confronted with no option but change, it can do so very rapidly. And all of those excuses which are constantly proffered fall away very quickly. Now, one of them is a miserable parallel because it involves the Second World War. The Second World War, when you think about it, was probably, outside of COVID, the recent pandemic, the last time pretty much the entire planet was under enormous stress. Our species was under stress. My father was a child in the war. I was brought up with stories about that. There's not a lot I can't tell you about the Supermarine Spitfire. My father grew up within sight of the airfield where it first flew on March the 5th, piloted by Matt Sumner. It was called the Shrew at the time. It was pale blue and the number was K5404. I cannot, however, in my mind, despite having watched any number of documentaries and read any number of books that my father gave me, comprehend what living in a global war was like. The horror, the suffering. None of us can, unless you lived through it, unless you're old enough to have been my father's age and you lived through it. It is incomprehensible. I'm now watching The World at War, a series made in the 1970s, for the third time, because I feel that I need to try and get to grips with that, because it's still happening in other parts of the world. But it's impossible. In the Second World War, America was producing large numbers of cars. It was producing millions of cars a year up until December the 8th or 7th, depending on the timeline, international timeline, date timeline. Because then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, from that day onwards, during the course of the Second World War, all of the motor manufacturers in North America produced no more than 150 new cars. So overnight, when presented with a terrifying threat, as it was at that point, the American industry just went like that. And of course, they built weapons, unfortunately, to continue the war. But we can do remarkable things when we're under stress. And we had a global pandemic. It wasn't an existential crisis, you see, was it? It was the fact that we were watching it on our news. It was playing out in front of our eyes. And if it wasn't on the news, very sadly, it was in our homes, in our communities. We were seeing people become very seriously ill and very sadly die. It was real. And then we took drastic action. We had a lockdown. We stopped flying. More importantly, perhaps, within 8 months, we'd come up with a vaccine which would save millions of people's lives. That's the human species. It is an organism that can react. It can do remarkable things remarkably quickly and remarkably successfully. We have the capacity to address the issue. It's not beyond us as a species. But we're not essentially a species. We're individuals that form that, aren't we? Each one of us has got different aims, objectives, histories, personalities, characteristics. So how are we going to achieve it? Because not any one of us at this point in time, and it's global action that's required, isn't it? Because when you think about it, we're one species on one planet with one massive problem and one last chance to sort it out. And yet we still entertain, forgive me, it's a vulgar expression and it's confrontational, but the luxury of war. We're still killing one another over ideologies, politics, money, religion, when the whole planet is, really in a desperate position. How bonkers is that? We've got to empower ourselves as individuals. That's where it starts, I think. Knowing that we can make a difference. That when those opportunities arise for us, or we generate those opportunities, we can take them. Those opportunities being steps that we can take to reduce our environmental impact, live more sustainably in a plethora of ways. And if we do take those opportunities, as and when they arise, and they may be different at different times for all of us, then we feel good about it. Why wouldn't we? What do? I bank with the only truly green bank in the UK. No fossil fuels, no weapons, none of that. I get green energy, so that's good. I mean, that took me, in order to sign up for those, took less than probably, half an hour. So that didn't take a lot of my time, but I feel good about it. I'm quite, I'm happy to tell you that I can get out my Triodos card and wave it around. It doesn't make me smug. It just makes me think, well, I did it. It didn't cost me anything. I feel better about it. I'm not invested in fossil fuels. I'm trying to shut that industry down, through a transition, but I'm trying to shut the industry down. Why would I want to be giving it my money? That's bonkers. These are simple little things. I'm fortunate that I can drive an electric car, not the be-all and end-all of all of our problems, but if you're a kid in an overcrowded city that's got asthma, choking on fumes, then every time an electric car goes by, you'd probably be smiling a bit. So they have a role to play at this point. But I'm lucky because I've got off-road parking and I've installed a charger. A lot of people aren't in that position, so they're not in a position to perhaps even afford an electric car or even manage it. So there's opportunities that arise that might be pertinent for us as individuals, but maybe not our neighbours. So that means that we've got to move through a transition. And transition is the key word, I think, because I'm a vegan as well. I don't eat meat or dairy products, and I find it really difficult actually to sort of talk about that. Not because, only because veganism is blighted by what I call the ultra-vegans. You're either in the club or you're not. I'm going to lift my shirt, if you don't mind. I'll do it discreetly. You see this? This is a leather belt. Oh my God. Why have I got a leather belt on? I'm a vegan. Well, I'll tell you why, because I've had this belt about 25 years. Right? If I chuck it into landfill and then buy another one, I'm just consuming more stuff. When this belt breaks, well, it's been going for 25 years, it may not. If I last another 25 years, it doesn't break, I'm still going to be wearing it. If it does, I'll replace it with a vegan alternative. You know, because I'm still going through that transition. That's what we should be doing. You're not a bad person if you're not a vegan. You're a better person if you're thinking about eating less meat. You're a slightly better person if you've actually cut down on some of that meat and you're going veggie one day a week. Maybe you're a little slightly better person if you cut out meat, you eat it once a week and you're vegan 2 days a week. All of those, as far as I'm concerned, are steps towards the type of progress that we want. So I have a tolerance that the ultra-vegans don't have, you know, because I know that we won't all start to make those changes at the same time and at the same pace. So that transition requires patience. And patience requires kindness. And that, for me, is the key ingredient that we need to embrace. Now, there will be conversations that have taken place today. And I know what it's like because I'm involved in these sorts of conversations, these sorts of forums quite a lot of the time. And you'll talk to people and you'll think, wow, they're really switched on. That's a really good... I've already heard actually downstairs some really good ideas. That's an amazing idea. And then I think to other people and I think, oh my God, you've got to need to ramp that up a bit. You know, you need to get going. I mean, that's okay, but there's so much more you could be doing. It's about encouraging those people. It's about working with them. It's about opening their eyes to those opportunities. It's about facilitating those opportunities. It's about working together. And what we have here today at this expo is an enormous diversity of skills from different parts of this community coming together, hopefully to synergize, you know, the 2 + 2 = 5 equation, whereby working together, things progress more quickly, more ably, more successfully. And I think that is, again, critical to our success. These are not things that we can do on our own. And lastly, as much as we will strive to empower ourselves, come together, share our ideas, grow communities, empower those communities, ultimately, we still need to be in a position at this critical time, because of a lack of time, to be able to direct our decision makers, those people who we have elected. And we have to make them listen. There's no question of that. And that means that we have to ask them. Now, we are fortunate. We live in some semblance of a democracy. It seems to be crumbling, but there's still enough of it there where you can protest in certain ways without the risk of instant imprisonment for the rest of your life. Now, in some parts of the world, that simply isn't possible. So let's remember that we are fortunate to be able to raise our voices. And whilst that persists, and of course it is being eroded, whilst that persists, it is our duty to raise our voices. We've got to shout above the noise. We've got to promote those demands in order to promote change. So my request for you, since you're involved and you're clearly here cooperating, you're energised, passionate and productive in what you're doing, is to ask you to do one more thing. And that is, at this point, you will have a zone of comfort where you are happy to, what should we say, speak out, maybe even protest. You might sign petitions. You might do online surveys. You might, I don't know, maybe go on an occasional march. But whatever that zone is, at this point in time, my transitional, patient, kind request is that you step up one rung on the ladder. I'm not asking you to break the law. I don't want you to glue yourselves to anything. I don't want you to throw, powder over a snooker board or paint over a building. I want you to know that your voice is important, because collectively our voice has to count. We have to turn them at this point. Otherwise they will drive our species over the cliff. That's plain to see from the announcements made by our government this week. Short-term political gain to win a few votes rather than the necessary investment in the policies that we know that we need so that we can guarantee ourselves, our children and our grandchildren a healthy future. Please protest, because when injustice is law, rebellion is duty. Thank you.